Madeline stood firm, her polished demeanor unwavering. She had seen plenty of men like him, dreamers, pretenders, those who wanted a taste of luxury without the means to afford it. Her fingers drummed lightly against the desk as she eyed him. "Of course," she said, her tone laced with skepticism, "but we do require proof of funds before proceeding with any paperwork." The man remained unfazed, his expression unreadable. "That won't be a problem," he replied evenly. His calmness irked Madeline. She was used to people proving themselves, scrambling to convince her they belonged in a place like this. Still, she wasn't about to waste time on someone who didn't fit the usual clientele. "I'm sure," she said, her voice carrying the weight of dismissal. "But this model is in high demand. We only cater to serious buyers." Greg shifted uncomfortably beside her. He had seen this scenario play out before, but something about the man's confidence unsettled him. The man simply nodded, as if expecting this. "I understand," he said. "Perhaps you should check the name on the dealership's ownership records before making assumptions." Madeline frowned, her practiced smile faltering. "Excuse me?" "I'm Elijah Carter," the man stated, watching her carefully. "I own Hamilton Prestige Motors." A heavy silence settled over the showroom. Madeline's stomach dropped. Greg's eyes widened. Elijah let the revelation sink in before speaking again. "Now, about that Range Rover," he said, his voice measured. "Would you like to show me the paperwork, or should I find someone else who will?" Madeline swallowed hard, heat creeping up her neck. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her, but Elijah Carter was already walking past her toward his car. The lesson was clear. She let out a small, controlled breath, composing herself. "Of course," she said smoothly. "For cash buyers, exceptions can be made, but as I mentioned, we require verification before proceeding." Her tone was laced with polite dismissal, certain that this man was bluffing. Greg remained silent, though a faint unease settled in his gut. He had seen Madeline turn away plenty of customers over the years, but something about this interaction felt off, like a slow-burning fuse leading to an inevitable explosion. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket again and pulled out a black leather checkbook, the kind that exuded old money and authority. He flipped it open, casually scrawling a number onto the top page before tearing it out and placing it onto the desk between them. Madeline's breath hitched as her eyes flickered down. The check bore the full price of the Range Rover, $165,000, written in effortless penmanship. Silence stretched. Greg's pulse ticked up. He glanced at Madeline, whose once unshakable poise now seemed brittle. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the check as if touching it would confirm its legitimacy. The man tilted his head slightly, watching her reaction with quiet amusement. "I assume this meets your verification requirements." His voice was calm, but the weight of his words settled like lead between them. Madeline swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. For the first time in years, she was at a loss for words. Greg exhaled, slowly bracing himself. He had seen Madeline maneuver situations like this before, steering the conversation back into her control with effortless precision. She squared her shoulders, giving the man in the hoodie a measured look. "As I mentioned earlier," she said smoothly, "we have policies in place to ensure our time isn't wasted. I trust you understand." The man met her gaze without hesitation, his expression unreadable. "Of course," he replied, his tone neutral. "Just making sure I have the rules straight." Greg noted the way Madeline subtly adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist, a habit she had when she felt the need to reassert dominance. "If you're truly interested, we'd be happy to discuss options," she continued, voice laced with finality. "Otherwise, I wouldn't want to keep you." Jared shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension, but the man in the hoodie didn't seem affected. If anything, he looked amused. "Good to know," he said lightly. "I wouldn't want to waste anyone's time." Then, without another word, he turned and strolled toward the exit, his pace unhurried, his posture relaxed. But Greg wasn't fooled. He had seen enough to know when someone was simply biding their time. The bell above the glass doors chimed as the man stepped outside, and for a brief moment, the showroom felt heavier, as if something important had just happened. Something Madeline hadn't quite caught on to yet. Greg had a sinking feeling she was about to find out. Greg could feel the unease settling deep in his gut. The man wasn't just another turned-away customer. He was something else, something Madeline had failed to recognize. She stood rigid, her polished exterior intact, but there was a stiffness in her stance that hadn't been there before. A flicker of doubt, buried beneath layers of practiced authority. The man continued his slow, deliberate walk, pausing near, a sleek Aston Martin, his fingers gliding over the polished surface. He wasn't angry, wasn't frustrated. If anything, he looked entertained. Greg stole a glance at Madeline, whose eyes remained locked on the man, her lips pressed into a thin line. He knew that look. She was running through every possibility in her mind, searching for a way to justify what had just happened. But no explanation would change the reality of the situation. She had dismissed a man who had proven, in the simplest way possible, that he belonged here. And still, she had refused him. The bell above the door chimed as the man reached the exit. He didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the tension he had left in his wake. He simply stepped outside, the doors swinging shut behind him. Greg exhaled slowly. He had a feeling they hadn't seen the last of him. A predator might watch wounded prey. The edges of his mouth lifted slightly, but there was no warmth behind it. "Let's just say," he said casually, "I got a first-hand look at how decisions are made here." Elliot's brow furrowed, glancing at Madeline, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the polished showroom floor. "I'm not sure I follow," he said cautiously. Jordan didn't reply right away. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Greg, who swallowed hard. He knew the question before it came. "Greg," Jordan said smoothly, "how long have you worked here?" Greg hesitated, then cleared his throat. Almost 5 years, sir." Jordan nodded, thoughtfully. "And in those 5 years, have you ever seen a customer asked for proof of income before being allowed to test drive?" Greg's pulse thundered. He knew the answer. Everyone in the room did. His gaze flickered toward Madeline, who was now staring at him, her expression a silent demand. But Jordan was his new boss. Greg wet his lips. "No, sir," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I haven't." The silence that followed was deafening. Elliot's expression darkened. His sharp gaze swung to Madeline, who stood frozen, her usually flawless composure beginning to crack. "Is that true?" he asked her, voice deceptively calm. Madeline opened her mouth, then shut it, struggling for words. Finally, she straightened her spine, forcing herself to meet Jordan's eyes. "I was following my instincts," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We have a high standard for clientele, and I was ensuring that standard was met." Jordan studied her for a long moment before exhaling softly. "Interesting," he murmured. Then he turned to Elliot. "We'll need to have a conversation about our management policies and hiring practices." Elliot's jaw tensed. "Understood," he said tightly. Jordan looked around the showroom one last time, then back at Madeline. His expression was unreadable. "I appreciate the hospitality," he said, his voice smooth as ever. "Really gave me some insight." Then, without another glance, he turned and walked toward the exit. The glass doors swung shut behind him, leaving behind a silence so thick it was suffocating. Madeline's hands trembled at her sides. Greg exhaled shakily, and Elliot Gaines, he was already pulling out his phone. The weight of his words pressed down on the room, suffocating in its quiet finality. Madeline's polished composure cracked further, but she held her ground, jaw tight, hands clasped in front of her to keep them from shaking. "Mr. Ellis." She tried again, her voice measured, controlled. "I assure you, I was only acting in the best interest of the dealership." Jordan let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "The dealership," he repeated. "Interesting, because from where I'm standing, you weren't protecting the dealership. You were protecting an image. Your image." Silence. Elliot's expression had turned to stone, his gaze flicking between them, assessing the damage. Greg, who had been standing stiffly behind the desk, swallowed hard. He had never seen Madeline at a loss for words. Until now. Jordan exhaled, slowly, then turned back to Elliot. "I'll be making some changes around here," he said simply. Madeline stiffened. "Sir, if you'll just allow me to explain." "You already did," Jordan interrupted, his tone still eerily calm. "And you made yourself very clear." He let the moment stretch, watching her squirm. Then, just as smoothly as he had walked in, Jordan Ellis turned and headed for the exit. But before he pushed the glass doors open, he glanced back. "Oh, and Madeline?" She met his eyes, her pulse hammering. "I'll be reviewing employee performance first thing Monday morning." With that, he was gone. The doors shut behind him, leaving behind an air of thick, choking silence. Greg risked a glance at Madeline. She stood frozen, her expression carefully blank, but her fingers were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. And Elliot? He was already reaching for his phone. A heavy silence settled over the showroom as Jordan's words hung in the air. Madeline stood rigid, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. But there was no fight left in her. She had spent years controlling every room she walked into, yet now she had no control at all. Greg dared a glance at Jared, who looked just as stunned. The other employees shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. No one spoke, up for her. No one tried to defend her. Jordan turned his attention back to Elliot. "We need to set a standard, one that actually reflects what this company claims to stand for." His tone was even, but there was no mistaking the finality. In his words, Elliot nodded. "Understood." Jordan gave one last sweeping look around the showroom. "Things are going to change," he said simply. Then, with that same calm, steady presence, he turned and walked away. Madeline didn't move. Couldn't. For the first time in her career, she had lost. Greg exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in the room shift. For the first time, it felt like someone in charge actually cared. Jordan turned back to Madeline one last time. "I hope this is a lesson," he said. "Because the real loss here isn't just your job, it's the opportunity to be better, to do better." Madeline's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Jordan gave a final nod. "Good luck." And with that, he walked away, leaving her standing there, alone. As the showroom doors closed behind him, the employees finally began to move. The air felt different, lighter, as if something long overdue had finally shifted. Greg exchanged a glance with Jared, a silent understanding passing between them. This wasn't just about one bad manager, it was about how people are treated, how power and assumptions shape an entire workplace. Jordan had walked in expecting to observe a business in action. Instead, he had exposed a problem much bigger than one person. It's easy to judge, to assume, to decide who belongs and who doesn't based on appearances. But how often do we stop and question our own biases? Madeline thought she was in control. She thought she knew who mattered. In the end, the only thing she controlled was her own downfall. If this story made you think, even for a second, share it. Let's start conversations that matter. And if you haven't yet, subscribe for more stories that challenge the way we see the world. Because sometimes the smallest decisions have the biggest consequences.